Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our monthly ACE meetup. Today's topic is networking, and obviously this is a pretty broad topic, so we have Chandrasekar from the Consulting Services team here to go through a brief presentation before we dive into the more general Q&A with the rest of the panelists. So feel free to go ahead and start typing in your questions at any point, even if they don't necessarily have to do with the specific presentation. And I do want to mention that when it comes to future state or roadmap questions, we may not be able to address them here live because of legal reasons, but don't forget that you can always reach out to your customer success manager. Also, keep in mind that the recording will be available on demand on the ACE registration page in about a week or so. So without further ado, take it away, Jay.
Perfect. Thanks, Michelle. Hi, everyone. Welcome to AutoScale ADC on AWS. That is a lot of acronyms, so I'll try to break it down. The ADC refers to the Citrix NetScaler product. AWS refers to Amazon Web Services. ADM, formerly known as MAS, is our enterprise orchestration tool that we'll be discussing today that is going to make the magic happen. And AutoScale is essentially saying that we can scale out the ADC or scale in based on certain conditions using the ADM. Now, while this presentation is based on a practical POC or proof of concept that I did for a customer specific to AWS, I do want to provide assurance that this functionality is available on Azure as well. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, let's discuss the agenda for today. We'll be starting out with AutoScale Basics with ADM. We'll talk about some of the considerations, prerequisites, etc. Then we'll talk about the AutoScale workflow with ADM, talk about traffic distribution methods, and I'll also go over in detail about how I set up my proof of concept, some of the issues I ran into and how I got around it, etc., and my overall impressions on the AutoScale functionality with ADM on AWS. Let's go to the next slide. So here at Citrix, we've been talking about hybrid multi-cloud now for a few years, where we discuss how organizations are now using a combination of on-prem, private cloud, and public cloud computing services to deliver their services. Citrix has long provided access to VPX on-prem, as well as public clouds, and hybrid deployments as well. DevOps are also a very big part of this hybrid multi-cloud as well, as we need to deal with new challenges like configuring instances and networking in the cloud, securing access to resources in the cloud, handling autoscale of backend resources, determining if the ADC is scalable with a single VPX for your unpredictable business needs, figuring out the problem of allowing business units to have access to the ADC without giving them hands-on access to the ADC itself. Now, typically on-prem, the answer to scalability involves getting a bigger, beefier hardware, and you can configure HA, or you could use a tier topology where you have a load balancer on top and you have a bunch of standalone ADC boxes at the bottom, and the top tier will essentially load balance to the distribution tier. Or you could also do clustering as well. In the software world with VPXs, especially on-prem or in the cloud, you have the same options where you can purchase the appropriate ADC licenses and compute. But today we want to talk about clustering in the cloud provided by Citrix ADM to automate not only the build of a specific ADM instance, but also the ability to roll out applications in an automated way and be able to scale in and out of the actual ADC itself based on resources in the box. And they could include things like memory, CPU, throughput, etc. There are a lot of benefits to using AutoScale, as you can imagine, right? Here you can focus on the application and not have to worry about the ADC, whether it's going to be scalable for you, etc. You can just focus on creating your application in a way that is provided to your business units, where they can come in and use our style books, etc., to create their application, which would automatically handle all the work that's required to configure the ADC and clustering decisions. Autoscaling also provides high availability of applications as well. Autoscaling ensures that your application always has the right number of ADC VPX instances to handle your traffic demands. That ensures that your application is up and running all the time, irrespective of traffic demands, going back to my earlier point about unpredictable business needs. You also have smart scaling decisions and zero-touch configuration. What that means is that the AutoScale feature constantly monitors your application and adds or removes ADC appliances dynamically based on demand. If you have a spike in demand, instances are automatically added. When the demand gets reduced, then the instances are automatically removed. And this is all done automatically, making it a zero-touch manual configuration. Like I said, you focus on the application and not the ADC. We also support automatic DNS management. What that means is you configure a zone in Route 53 on AWS. ADM will automatically create the appropriate records, the A records, etc., and automatically ensures that the traffic will be sent either over to the different IP addresses or to a load balancer. We also handle graceful connection termination. What that means is when you're scaling in, if you have any instances that are taking in connections, etc., those are gracefully removed as opposed to cutting those connections off. You also save on costs, because with auto-scaling, you're essentially increasing and decreasing your ADC instances as needed. And this allows you to optimize the cost with getting a appliance that you may not necessarily use all the time. So you're essentially saving money by launching instances only when they're needed and terminating them when they're not needed. Again, this is stuff that's done automatically by ADM. You are only paying for the resources that you're using. You also have granular access to the underlying health as well. So we provide a dashboard through ADM that allows you to monitor the health of the application. You can visualize things like the threshold parameter values, and you can also look at timestamp instances that are participating in AutoScale. For example, at some point, perhaps during a sale or something like that in a retail business, you may see that the number of instances may scale, say, from 2 to 5, and then when it dies down, it may go back to 1 or 2. And all of these things can be controlled through configurable values on the ADM. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so we already established that AutoScale on AWS is essentially clustering in the cloud, right? AutoScale does build on some concepts that you as an administrator or an architect would need to be familiar with. For example, you should be familiar using ADM and agents, including how to register an agent with the ADM service, right? As you guys may recall, you would have to type in the deployment_type.py script. You would point it towards the ADM server, and along with some details, etc., to ensure that the agent is registering with the server. Now, you'll also be using tools like CloudFormation templates, or if you're using Azure, you'll be using the appropriate logic in Azure as well, like the Azure templates, etc., to be able to automate a lot of that configuration. Now, if you are savvy in programming and scripting and things like that, I would highly recommend that you take a look at the scripts in those templates and modify them as needed. You'll also be using the Cloud Profile and AutoScale group features on ADM to configure your ADC and AutoScaling. Now, an AutoScale group is simply a group of ADC instances that load balance applications as a single entity and trigger AutoScaling based on your configured threshold parameter values. And an ADC cluster is a group of ADC VPX instances where each instance is called a node, and the client traffic is distributed across those nodes to provide high availability, throughput, scalability, etc. Stylebooks is a feature on ADM that essentially allows you to provide a GUI look and feel where you can put in form fields, etc. And that allows you to push configuration through the ADM to the NetScaler in a clustered setup. Now, we do provide sample stylebooks, etc. as part of this integration with AutoScale that can be used as a starter kit. You'll also be using Route 53 on AWS to be able to register your zone that will be used for your configuration. Once you create your zone, ADM will automatically create your records, etc., based on the inputs that you put in on the configuration. Finally, you should be familiar with concepts like ELB or ALB, elastic IP addresses or public IP addresses, etc., because you'll be using those as well. There are some other requirements as well. When you're setting it up on AWS, you do need to make sure that you have the ADM agent set up. It needs to be configured with the ADM service. It's supported, as I mentioned previously, on both Azure as well as AWS. There is a big caveat today that it does require the ADC subscription licenses on both AWS and Azure. So you would have to go to the AWS Marketplace, for example, and subscribe to a Citrix ADC, VPX, Enterprise, or as we now call it, Advanced Licensing on the ADC to ensure that you have the appropriate licensing. You cannot use standard if you are using the clustering feature with ADM. So you have to go with at least advanced or premium, or what used to be known as platinum, in order to use the feature. And you also most likely want to use the latest ADC image and the agent, which may be 13.0. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, when I got started with AutoScale for one of my customer deployments, I wasn't quite sure what I had to do manually and what was actually done through automation. So I'm happy to report that we don't have to create any backend infrastructure for ADC manually. All the stuff is done through a CloudFormation template, right? Now, you may want to modify the CloudFormation template if you want to change any specific naming conventions, attributes, etc., but you don't have to, right? You don't need to create the ADC itself or the AutoScale group on AWS or Azure. This is also done automatically by the ADM. You don't need to log into the GUI or the CLI or figure out how to use clustering and identifying how to configure any of that stuff. All of this stuff is going to be done automatically through ADM as well. When you're using stylebooks, you have the option to create objects on the GUI, for example, a load balanced VIP, etc., and ensure that it's part of a clustered configuration automatically. Let's say a few weeks go by and you decide that you don't want to use those applications anymore, the ones that you created. You'll always have the option of going back to the stylebook, hit delete, and it will automatically remove the configuration cleanly from the cluster on ADC. So that's a great feature as well. Let's move on to the next slide. Now, I mentioned previously that AutoScale, in addition to ADM, requires a few things, right? So there are quite a bit of prerequisites that need to be done. For example, things like interfaces, subnets, IAM policies, internet gateway, NAT gateway, elastic IPs, or elastic load balancers, etc. And if you're doing it manually, you do need to make sure all that stuff is set up correctly. There are some very specific requirements about identity management or IAM where there are certain naming conventions that need to be followed. And if those naming conventions aren't set up correctly, you will not be able to get this working. Now, I mentioned previously as well that when you're using the CloudFormation templates or scripts, it would automatically create all that for you. So I would say if you're doing this for the first time or the second time, go ahead and use the script that's available at the GitHub link that's linked over here on this slide to just go through it and ensure that you follow through it. It'll take probably a few minutes to get that done, but it will set up all the prerequisites for you in a very clean way. Now, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what I did in my environment when I set up this proof of concept. So in my validation of AutoScale on AWS with ADM, I created a new zone. I called it jautoscaledemo.com. So I had to register that in Route 53, which is a DNS server. I then used a GitHub template using the link that you see over here that to launch CFT1 or CloudFormation Template 1. There should be a screenshot popping up here as well, which handled all the subnets, interfaces, IAM roles, etc. automatically. Once that was done, I subscribed to a VPX 10 Enterprise or Advanced Edition license. I then created a Linux server for my test web server and added an ADM agent to the marketplace and subsequently connected that to the ADM service. Now, if you are using the ADM service, you do need to go to cloud.citrix.com and you can get a 30-day trial. I'm told that this works with ADM on-prem as well. However, I haven't tested that out yet. It is important to note that the documentation on the Citrix website does reference all the configuration specific to ADM as a service. So if you're following that, you may need to get a ADM service trial so you can validate that. There are several steps that need to be done on the ADM service as well that need to be done to add the agent, the associated ADC, create your AutoScale groups, etc. But once that's done, you'll be ready to deploy your application also from ADM through Stylebooks that will do the following. It will configure your servers, service groups, and virtual servers cleanly across all your instances. It'll configure a elastic load balancer to reference the VIPs in each instance. It'll create a record of the FQDN for your zone. So in my case, I specified in ADM that I wanted the application to be called webvserver. .jautoscaledemo.com. It creates it automatically, and it makes sure that DNS records references that elastic load balancer. In my example, I also specified that I wanted to have minimum of 2 instances, and I specified and I left the default parameters to allow for the scale out and scale in, but you can certainly play around with that after you have a chance to read the documentation and look at the specific values that make sense. But the way you can test it out is if you specified that you wanted at least 2 minimum instances, you can shut down one of them, and eventually you will see that a new ADC VPX would get spun up. The configuration would get replicated to that new VPX, and it would be part of that elastic load balancer or Azure load balancer and associated with the FQDN. This is all done automatically and behind the scenes. So from your perspective, you care about the application being up, and that's exactly what's going to happen. All the complexity about clustering will be done in the back end through ADM. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Okay, this is just a quick screenshot that popped up previously about the CloudFormation templates. So let's move on to the workflow. There are quite a bit with there's quite a bit over here on the workflow, so we'll go over it briefly here. There are some prerequisites that involve creating sites, creating a cloud access profile, attaching the agent with the site, etc. And on the NetScaler side, you do need to create the VPC, the autoscaling group, etc. Now, you don't have to do any of this stuff by hand. The only thing that you have to do really is ensure that you have your CloudFormation template, run it, create your ADM agent that you do have to do manually, and create your backend server. Once the agent gets added to the ADM service, the rest of the configuration is done by ADM, where you can go in, create your autoscaling group, which provisions the cluster in AWS. You can then subsequently deploy the application config in the ADC, and it'll apply it on the ADM and allow for the client traffic to be sent over to the backend server. You do have the option to use AutoScale on the back end. So if you have an application that has that is configured with a gold image and can scale, etc., you can have the NetScaler point to those servers that can scale and scale out as well, or you can point to simple web servers. So if you're not using AutoScale on the back end and you only have, say, for example, 2 servers, you can configure those manually as well. So you do have some options there. And like I said, with Stylebooks, you do have the option to create your load balancing configuration and have that automatically set up. Your clustering logic, et cetera, will all be handled directly through ADM. So there are quite a bit of steps here, but the good news is that all of this stuff is documented well in our Citrix eDocs and in a single page. And if you follow that, you will be able to get through this, and we'll have a link to those docs as well. Let's move to the next slide. Okay, so we have 2 traffic distribution modes, one being NLB, the other one being DNS-based. So NLB essentially means that the distribution tier to the cluster nodes is using a network load balancer. In this case, I use the AWS load balancer. The good news about using a NLB is that you're only using a single public IP address or EIP for a single application, right? That would get attached over to the load balancer, and all your backend resources can be private. So you don't need any other public IP addresses. That was, in fact, the distribution mode that I selected through ADM when I did my POC and my lab for this exercise as well. There is one caveat that it only supports TCP-based load balancing. So if you want to use UDP, you have to select the DNS-based autoscaling as well. Now, on the DNS side, it's slightly different than the NLB, where you actually need to have public IP addresses for each node in your cluster. So in my example, I had 2 VPX instances for one app, which would mean that I would need to have 2 public IP addresses and then 2 records, and then you'd have Route 53 essentially sending traffic over to each of those records, et cetera, by updating the domain name corresponding to the application. Right, and you can do that with Route 53 on AWS, and it should be similar on Azure as well. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so here I want to talk about some pros and cons for NLB versus DNS. Like I mentioned earlier, NLB does give you 1 static IP per availability zone, and everything else can be private. You don't actually even need to do anything on the ADC or the NetScaler. You don't need to log in. It's all done transparently through the ADM. We talked about the lack of support for UDP as well, and there's limited functionality for listeners as well. So if you have a listener on a specific TCP port, you can have that, but you can have it listening on a range, for example. Right, DNS-based autoscaling does support UDP, but you do need to have multiple public IP addresses, et cetera. And also, when you're using DNS with multiple names, you run into the risk of caching, which can lead to traffic overloading or black holing, et cetera. And those would be something that you'd want to watch out for and play around with the TTLs, et cetera, if you are going that way. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So here I'm just sharing a quick diagram that just shows the NLB distribution as well as the DNS base. So this one here just shows that you still need to have Route 53 for your zone, because you need to have a record that would point to your Elastic load balancer that would then send the traffic over to your VPX clusters, et cetera. So Route 53 is still required for you to have that zone, but you are using the load balancer here to send the traffic to all your NetScalers. And your NetScalers or ADCs could be distributed either in the same availability zone, or they could be across multiple availability zones. I also mentioned previously that you could have different autoscaling on the back end as well. So if you have backend servers that are using AutoScale, then you can have the NetScaler automatically pick those servers up and remove the servers as needed. So an example would be if you had 2 backend servers and you're using AutoScale in AWS to increase it to 5, the NetScaler will automatically recognize that the servers have gone from 2 to 5 and add those in automatically to the service group. And if those go down, the scale in part, then I'll reduce it back to 2. So that's AutoScale on the back end. So in this scenario, we're talking about AutoScale both on the front end and back end. But AutoScale on the back end is not strictly required for AutoScale on the front end. You can still do everything that I've just described here with the ADC cleanly and not do AutoScale on the back end and just have static servers if you choose to. But if you are using back-end servers that would benefit from AutoScale, the ADC certainly does offer that. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Okay, this is an example of AutoScale using DNS distribution. So it's kind of similar to the diagram that we saw previously, except over here we're not using the load balancer at all, right? I mentioned previously that you do need public IP addresses for all the NetScalers or ADCs that are going to be participating in the cluster. So in this case, if you have 4 nodes for one application, you will have 4 IP addresses, 4 DNS records, etc. And the ADM will ensure that the traffic steering is handled through those DNS records appropriately. So you do have more IP addresses, and I talked about the fact that you could run into some issues with caching, etc. So you kind of have to decide which one you want to go with. I would say that for simple POCs and deployments, I would start with NLB and try out the DNS as well at a later point. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. So the Citrix docs do provide a lot of detail that provide integration with ADM and AWS, etc. I did mention that it is specific to ADM service. I was confused when I went through it initially because I thought it would reference a ADM on-prem, etc. And I was looking at the configuration, which didn't really make any sense. But once I identified that it was specific to ADM service, then I went ahead and got a trial to move forward with this. It does have a lot of information. There are prerequisites that need to be done. I made the mistake of not reading through the prerequisites carefully, and there were some points where I was puzzled. But going back to the documentation, it does specifically tell you that you need to do certain things. For example, you have to subscribe to the correct ADC AMI instance. If you don't subscribe to it initially, when you run the AutoScale group later on, it will not run properly, and it'll give you an error stating that the instances were not subscribed, etc. So you have to kind of go back, subscribe to it again, subscribe to it, and then come back and run it again. So I would ensure that you guys are following the prerequisites very, very carefully. There are also some other things specific to IAM integration where it needs to follow the correct naming conventions. So I would also, again, use a CloudFormation template, which is a script to have those created. And there are some specific things regarding external account IDs, etc., that need to match, that are documented in the Citrix eDocs that you can reference as well, that talks about how they need to be set up, etc. You will recall that if you log into the ADC initially, you would have to log in with the NSRoot user account, and the password would be the AMI instance ID. But in this case, you're not actually logging into the NetScalers at all. You'll be making all these changes through ADM, and with ADM, you can push in profiles that can change the password for the NetScaler, so you don't have to worry about remembering the ID, etc. One aspect I did find, though, is about the ADM agent. When you're logging into the ADM agent on-prem, you typically log in with NSRecover as a username, NSRoot for the password as your initial configuration before you run the deployment type py script, and it allows you to use the NSRoot account. Now, in AWS, the password is always the AMI instance ID initially. So you have to remember to use the instance ID for your password along with the NSRecover username. We already discussed the fact that the ADM can have profiles that can change credentials, etc. So I'm happy to report that at least overall, AutoScale does seem to work pretty smoothly. The documentation does provide sufficient information to outline the integration between agent, ADM service, ADC, etc. And at the end of the day, it gives you a chance to develop applications through style books for your end users that are automatically clustered, provide scalability, provide availability, etc. So it works pretty well. I'm very happy with it. We are going to be doing some more testing on the CCS side for Azure as well, and we'll report back. That's all I had, Michelle.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jay. I do have one last item before moving into the Q&A piece, and that is to just let everyone know about our new Cloud Success Center. It is a really helpful one-stop shop, has a wealth of cloud resources, including expert-led videos, prerequisite checklists, build guides, and more. So just be sure to check that out. And without further ado, the part that you've all been waiting for. So joining Jay today on our expert panel, we have Arvind Kandula. He's a principal product manager. Hari Subramaniam, a product manager, and David Aimley, a sales engineer. So go ahead, if you haven't typed in your question, keep adding them to the box, and we will go through and dive into the questions now. Thank you so much. All right, perfect. So we actually do have a last-minute switch up on presenters. Panelists. Instead of Arvind Kandula, today we have Dave Potter, a senior solutions architect. But like I said, go ahead and keep putting those questions in, and we will go ahead and address them. So first up, this one is for Hari. We are not using dynamic routing, but an IP set across the cluster. How does this work with ALB for distribution?
Perfect, Michelle. So for autoscaling Citrix ADC on Azure, so Azure LB or ALB is used for distribution of traffic. So each IP added to the IP set is mapped with one of the nodes in the cluster. And also these IPs are added to the backing pool of the ALB. So that's how it works.
All right, perfect. Next up for Jay, we have, does AutoScale functionality work without ADM or ADM service?
Hey, Michelle. The answer is no. That is an absolute requirement. So this particular proof of concept that I did was with ADM service, but ADM is an absolute required component for this exercise.
All right, perfect. So for Dave Potter, are there any limitations that we need to be aware of when using AutoScale?
Oh, that's a pretty good one. So are there any limitations with AutoScale? I think the first, it's not really a limitation, it's just how do you want to set it up? So first of all, to use AutoScale, your application needs to be deployed within a style book. So this, we may be able to answer this slightly differently, but I think the only limitation that you need to be aware of is that you'll be making your config changes or deploying your application through the construct of a style book. So there's no otherwise traditional limitation if you think of in terms of when to scale up, when to scale in, or whether you want to do that on CPU throughput or memory. All those triggers are available to you, so it should be fairly complex and complete.
All right, perfect. So the next one, we have a multi-part kind of longer question. So is there, we'll send this one over to Hari. So is there a backplane? And if so, which interfaces is that occurring on? Do we need dedicated interfaces for the backplane, or does it only happen over the primary interface, which is usually the management plane?
Yeah, good one. So no dedicated interface used for backplane here, and the primary interface is used as the backplane. There is no dedicated interface.
All right. So next one for Jay, what type of style books do we support for using AutoScale?
Yep, so today we support style books for load balancing and content switching, but we do expect to grow that in the near future.
Okay, perfect. All right, so David Ainley. I'm not sure if this one you'll be able to address, but we'll see. I think who is using public cloud? All of my clients are on-prem.
Yeah, so we actually we're seeing an uptick in a lot of different sectors that are utilizing it. A lot of e-commerce based, kind of a essentially anything it's e-commerce based, where it's an online presence, primarily ran businesses. Those typically we're seeing a high interest in moving out of the data centers and up into these managed infrastructure. So I would say it's kind of a scattering across the fields, but if I had to peg one field that's getting traction, it would be e-commerce.
All right. So coming back to Dave Potter, when can I leverage AutoScale versus using HA or GSLB?
Yeah, so AutoScale in today's initial deployment, the way that we see it used primarily is with kind of your typical load balancing or content switching services. So if you're doing gateway or you're doing link load balancing, for example, or any of the other corner use cases, firewall load balancing, you may want to hold back on AutoScale because of the unpredictable nature of when a node may come up or go away. And that may impact long living connections as opposed to web-based traffic, which is very short by nature and also persistent by nature. So just think about that through. If your services are short-lived or the connections are short-lived and the session's long, then AutoScale is perfect for you. It's also perfect if you need to or you will expect a large flux in traffic when coming into an application and you need to be able to handle that demand.
All right, great. Next one for Hari. Where is the persistence configured for AutoScale on Azure?
Yeah, so persistence is configured on the Azure load balancer here. There is a nice link how the persistence works on ALB. Probably we can share it later. So that traffic from the same client always goes to the same VPX. That's how we make sure persistence is configured.
All right, so going back to Jay, how do I integrate AutoScale to an existing ADC environment in the cloud?
That's a good question. Today, you can't. That is a short answer. If you have an existing ADC environment, there's no way to add AutoScale to it. That may come up in the future, but the idea of AutoScale today is for folks who are working in a greenfield environment and they have a set of applications that can be accomplished in a standardized fashion through a style book, and they want the ability to effortlessly AutoScale in and out, et cetera. And that's where the style books and the AutoScale functionality will really shine.
All right, great. And then for Hari, are we then limited to 1 gigabyte of backplane traffic if steering has to occur?
And this is coming from a pure cluster standpoint, I believe. Yeah, so if you see in how clustering works on NetScaler or Citrix ADC, there's a process local, right? So process local is configured so there is no data packet straighting involved in this case. So that's how it works.
All right, so for Jay, what are the limitations when using ELB for traffic distribution? It will not support Citrix Gateway, for example?
Yep. In terms of, so specific to features, right, you are somehow today limited to load balancing and content switching because, as Dave mentioned in another answer, you can use style books, but there's no limitation in terms of AutoScale in, out, et cetera. But in terms of features, you would have to use the features that are available within the style book. In this case, that would be load balancing, content switching. In the slide, we talked about some of the limitations of ELB traffic, NLB traffic distribution where it doesn't support UDP and things like that. But in terms of feature set, you need to ensure that your users are using the ones that are designated through the style books.
All right, perfect. Well, hey, that is all of the questions that we have coming in so far. We'll give you guys a couple more minutes if you're still typing out anything or if you have any questions, we can answer them as they come in. But as I wait for that, I just want to plug a couple more events that are upcoming. So again, feel free to keep typing in your questions, and then keep an eye out for a blog write-up. And then also the on-demand video will be available in the next week or so. And then definitely be sure to join us next month, third Wednesday of every month at 9 a.m. Eastern. The topic next month is going to be Director and Studio. So definitely join us again for a new topic and a new panel of experts, and bring all of your questions.
Yeah, Michelle, one more thing. I think Jay is here and Dave Potter is here, if this is live, right? So basically, Dave's video addressed about AWS, right? So we have the good that questions came for Azure as well. So we have the same solution also available on Azure. So Jay and Dave, do you want to talk about it?
Sure, Dave, do you want to take that one first? I can add some additional notes to it.
Could you clarify, Hari, for with Azure? So what line are you thinking with?
The whole presentation of Jay involved about autoscaling on AWS, right? So we have the similar solution Azure.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Sure. So yeah, AutoScale is available on both AWS and Azure. I think one of the good questions that came up was limitations with AutoScale. Obviously, you'd want to do AutoScale for the auto provisioning capability as well as the amount of throughput. I don't think it was mentioned anywhere that there is a limitation in AWS not related to Citrix. It's an AWS limitation in that NLB and ELB are limited to 1.5 gigabits of throughput as EC2 instances. Our clustering mechanism is not dependent on that because each node is receiving its own throughput. So if you're doing AutoScale for extreme throughput capacity is no limitation when it comes to our solution. Now, if you reach over into Azure and you think about the same setup there, our AutoScale capability also removes any limitations that you may have, perhaps dependent on the size of the machine type that you're deploying, perhaps the number of interfaces that you're deploying. We can overcome those limitations by adding additional nodes automatically. So we have the same AutoScale feature available in both AWS and Azure. And in fact, when you go to configure it, it's as easy as just going in and walking through the GUI, through the different menus to create your connector profile that connects into Azure. And then it goes ahead and automatically sets up the machine type and deploys the cluster node, stands it up for you, gets it licensed, and then from that point forward, you're able to deploy one of your two AutoScale style books. Again, the feature is seamless between Azure and AWS, or should I say it's rather agnostic. So it's compatible with both, and we have the equal amount of features on both.
Yeah.
Yep, and I would also add to what Dave said, just with respect to kind of automation, since I do like to play around with that, right? So one of the aspects that I mentioned in this presentation was that the GitHub site for getting templates for CFT were very helpful in addressing a lot of the prerequisites for the ADC. And the same would apply for Azure as well, where you'd be able to get these ARM templates and be able to deploy those. And you definitely want to take advantage of these built-in templates or scripts that we have, or tweak them to add your own flavor. Because if you're not making specific changes in terms of naming conventions that I alluded to in the presentation already for things like IAM policies, profiles, roles, etc., you are going to have issues. So it's always a good place to start and take advantage of those scripts in order for it to kind of create everything. If you don't like some of the naming conventions that it uses, you can always go back and tweak the script and run it again and remove your resources and things like that. So it makes it very attractive.
Perfect, Jay. It means that the prerequisite is very important in this case, right? So we can use the scripts to do all your prerequisites that needs to be done before we start off provisioning, or the ADM starts the provisioning. Perfect answer. Thank you.
All right, perfect. Well, if the panelists don't have anything else that they want to add, do you guys have anything left? It seems like we don't have any other questions coming in, so anything that you want to add before I let everyone get back to their Wednesday? All right. Well, thank you guys all so much for joining. And like I said, this is going to be available live, or excuse me, on demand on the same page that we went to register, so bit.ly.a/Citrix. And we'll see you guys next month. Thank you so much. Have a good one.